Hi everyone, my name is Mark, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. At 3:12 in the morning, Matthew Coleman was lying in bed next to his children, 2-year-old Kaleo and 10-month-old Roxy, in a hotel room in the Mexican resort town of Rosarito. The gentle sound of their breathing filled the darkness as he typed out a text message to his wife back in Santa Barbara. Matthew wrote, "Hi babe, miss you too. Things have been rough, but starting to get some clarity as well. Still confused on a lot of things though, and processing through them. So many crazy thoughts going through my head right now, hard to explain." But Matthew wasn't just confused. He was about to do something unthinkable. Something that would shatter the illusion of the perfect family he and his wife Abby had built together. Something that would reveal the terrifying power of conspiracy theories to transform a loving father into a monster. By the next morning, 2 small bodies would be discovered on a remote Mexican ranch. A family would be destroyed forever, and the world would learn how online delusions can become deadly reality, turning love into violence and fathers into killers. This is the story of Matthew Coleman and how conspiracy theories convinced him that his own children had to die. Matthew Taylor Coleman first met Abby Droogsma through their shared Christian faith communities. Although they lived hundreds of miles apart, Matt in Santa Barbara, California, and Abby in Texas, they connected through church groups and began communicating regularly about their faith, dreams, and shared values. Matthew couldn't help but be drawn to Abby's genuine devotion to Christianity and her warm personality. What made Abby particularly appealing to Matthew was her dedication to living a Christ-centered life. Matthew had grown up in a Christian household where faith was very important to him, and he loved that Abby felt the same way. He found solace in their shared beliefs and their mutual desire to serve God together. Matthew was a passionate surfer who had built his life around both his love for the ocean and his Christian faith. He had attended Point Loma Nazarene University, an evangelical Christian college in San Diego, where he studied history and competed on the surf team. After graduation, he earned a master's degree in Spanish from UC Santa Barbara. It was only a matter of time before Matt decided to pop the question to Abby. Their courtship had been largely conducted through phone calls, texts, and occasional visits due to the distance between California and Texas. Those close to Matthew noted that their relationship seemed to progress quite quickly, but both were eager to start their lives together as husband and wife. On January 8, 2017, Matthew and Abby celebrated their love in a wedding ceremony that reflected their deep Christian faith and Matthew's passion for surfing. Their special day was filled with joy, laughter, and a clear demonstration of their shared commitment to living according to their religious beliefs. Shortly after their wedding, the couple settled in Santa Barbara, where Matthew had spent most of his life and where he felt most at home near the ocean. Matthew had already established himself as a respected figure in Santa Barbara's Christian surfing community. He had founded Love Water Surf School, which offered surf lessons combined with Christian mentorship for young people. The company's motto, "For the Love of Surfing," reflected Matthew's belief that he could use his passion for the ocean to share his faith with others. Abby joined him in running the business, working alongside her husband to create what they believed was a ministry that would impact young lives for the better. Matthew's dedication to his faith was evident to everyone who knew him. He had served as the chapter leader for Christian Surfers United States Santa Barbara chapter, mentoring local youth in both surfing and Bible study. Those who worked with him described him as someone who genuinely cared about children and wanted to help them grow in their faith. His passion for serving others came from his own experiences with Christian mentors who had influenced his life, and he was determined to pass on that heritage of serving Jesus through love and action. The couple's life together seemed idyllic from the outside, and in 2019, their happiness seemed complete when their son Kaleo Sky Coleman was born. Matthew was overjoyed to become a father, and he frequently posted on social media about his love for his son and his excitement about teaching him to surf one day. The birth of Kaleo represented everything Matthew had dreamed of: a loving family, a successful ministry through surfing, and the opportunity to raise a child in the Christian faith that meant so much to him. Matthew couldn't help but see Kaleo as a gift from God, and he was determined to be the kind of father who would guide his son in faith and love. He often spoke about looking forward to the day when he could teach Kaleo to stand on a surfboard and share with him the joy he found in both surfing and his relationship with Jesus. Those who knew Matthew during this time described him as a devoted father who was genuinely excited about the responsibilities of parenthood. In late 2020, the Coleman family welcomed their second child, a daughter they named Roxy Coleman. Matthew was thrilled to have a daughter, and he saw her birth as another blessing from God. On social media, he described feeling that Roxy was being born at a pivotal time in history, and that she would represent a new dawn or awakening. At the time, those who read his posts thought he was simply expressing the joy and hope that many new parents feel about their children's futures. However, as 2020 progressed and the COVID-19 pandemic began to affect daily life throughout the country, Matthew's perspective on the world around him began to shift in ways that were not immediately apparent to those closest to him. While his surfing school actually thrived during the pandemic, as parents looked for outdoor activities for their children, Matthew began to spend increasing amounts of time researching topics online that would eventually consume his thinking. Matthew couldn't help but notice the fear and uncertainty that seemed to pervade society during the early months of the pandemic. Like many people, he began searching for explanations and answers to help him understand what was happening in the world. Unfortunately, his research led him to online communities and theories that would gradually distort his understanding of reality in dangerous ways. Initially, Matthew's interest in alternative explanations for world events seemed relatively harmless to those around him. He would occasionally mention to friends that he was reading about various theories regarding political and social issues, often saying that while some of these ideas sounded crazy, they also seemed to make sense in certain ways. His wife Abby joined him in some of this research, as both of them sought to understand what they perceived as troubling changes in society. As Matthew delved deeper into online conspiracy communities, his worldview began to incorporate increasingly extreme and paranoid beliefs. He became convinced that a secret cabal of powerful elites was working behind the scenes to control world events and harm innocent people, particularly children. These beliefs were reinforced by QAnon conspiracy theories, which claimed that a shadowy group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles was engaged in a global conspiracy against humanity. Matthew's research into these conspiracy theories became more intense and consuming over time. He began to see signs and connections everywhere, interpreting ordinary events and social media posts as evidence of the conspiracy he believed was unfolding around him. What particularly troubled those close to him was his growing paranoia about people in his own life, including close friends and even church leaders, whom he began to suspect of being involved in the conspiracy. According to Abby, Matthew became significantly more paranoid that people around him were involved in the conspiracy he believed existed. He started doing extensive research on leaders in their church community and became convinced that some of them might be part of the broader conspiracy he was researching. His paranoia extended to their social circle as he began interpreting photographs and social media posts as containing hidden messages or signs that revealed people's true allegiances. Matthew's behavior became increasingly concerning to those who knew him well. He would analyze social media photos, looking for hand gestures, symbols, or other signs that he believed revealed whether people were evil disguised as good. He became convinced that peace signs and other common gestures were actually indicators that the people making them were part of the conspiracy against humanity. This level of analysis and paranoia represented a significant departure from the loving, trusting person that friends and family had known. As Matthew's beliefs became more extreme, his relationship with reality became increasingly tenuous. He began experiencing what he described as visions and signs that he believed were revealing crucial information about the conspiracy around him. These experiences were not shared or understood by others, which only served to increase his isolation and strengthen his conviction that he was receiving special knowledge that others could not access. By the summer of 2021, Matthew's mental state had deteriorated to the point where he believed he was receiving direct communications from Q, the anonymous figure at the center of QAnon conspiracy theories. He began to see himself as having a special role in the fight against the conspiracy he believed threatened the world. In his mind, he was like Neo from the Matrix, chosen to see through the illusions that deceived other people and to take action to save humanity. Matthew's paranoia eventually focused on his own family in ways that were both tragic and terrifying. He became convinced that his wife Abby had somehow been compromised by the conspiracy and that she possessed what he called serpent DNA that connected her to the evil forces he believed controlled the world. Even more devastating, he came to believe that this serpent DNA had been passed on to their children, Kaleo and Roxy. In Matthew's distorted thinking, his beloved children were no longer the precious gifts from God he had once celebrated. Instead, he began to see them as potential threats to humanity who would grow up to become monsters if something was not done to stop them. The man who had once looked forward to teaching his son to surf and who had celebrated his daughter's birth as a blessing now viewed them through the lens of his paranoid delusions. The transformation in Matthew's thinking represented a complete break from reality. The loving father who had once comforted other parents who had lost children was now convinced that his own children posed a danger to the world. His faith, which had once been a source of strength and guidance, had become twisted by conspiracy theories into something that justified unspeakable actions. On August 7, 2021, Matthew made a decision that would destroy multiple lives and shock the Santa Barbara community that had known him as a caring teacher and devoted father. Without telling Abby his true intentions, he loaded 2-year-old Kaleo and 10-month-old Roxy into the family's Mercedes Sprinter van and left their Santa Barbara home. Abby had been preparing for what she thought would be a family camping trip, but instead, Matthew drove away with their children without explanation. Initially, Abby was not overly concerned about Matthew's departure with the children. She contacted the Santa Barbara Police Department to report that her husband had left with their children for an unknown destination and was not responding to her calls or text messages. However, she told police that she did not believe Matthew would harm the children and initially indicated that she wasn't worried about their safety. Her primary concern at that point was that Matthew had left without the proper car seat for their youngest child. What Abby didn't know was that Matthew had already crossed the point of no return in his thinking. As he drove south toward the Mexican border, he was convinced that he was embarking on a mission to save the world from the monsters he believed his children would become. In his mind, this was not an act of violence against innocent children, but rather a necessary sacrifice to prevent a greater evil from spreading throughout humanity. Matthew drove to Rosarito, a coastal city in Baja California, Mexico, just south of the U.S.-Mexico border. Surveillance footage from the City Express Hotel showed Matthew checking into the hotel with both children on Saturday evening. The footage captured what appeared to be a normal family traveling together, with no indication of the horrific events that would unfold just hours later. On the morning of August 9, 2021, at approximately 3 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Matthew leaving the hotel with Kaleo and Roxy. He drove to a remote location near Rancho del Cielo, where he believed he would carry out what he saw as his divinely appointed mission. In his deeply disturbed mental state, Matthew was convinced that killing his children was the only way to prevent them from growing into monsters and spreading their corrupted DNA throughout the world. What happened next was a scene of unimaginable horror that would forever shatter multiple families and communities. Matthew used a spearfishing gun to attack his children, shooting them in their chests in what can only be described as an act of unfathomable cruelty. 2-year-old Kaleo did not die immediately, and Matthew later confessed that he had to move the spear around to complete the killing, cutting his hand in the process. 10-month-old Roxy, just a baby who had never known anything but love from her father, was also murdered with the same weapon. After killing his children, Matthew moved their small bodies approximately 30 yards from the road and left them in the brush, covering them in an apparent attempt to conceal the crime. He then discarded the bloody weapon and his blood-stained clothing at a nearby location, before returning to the hotel alone. Hours later, he checked out of the hotel and began the drive back to the United States, leaving behind the bodies of his 2 innocent children in the Mexican countryside. Around 7:30 a.m. on August 9, 2021, a farm worker named Roberto Salinas Ramirez made a horrifying discovery near his home at the Rancho El Descanso agricultural ranch. His son's dog had been barking at something in the brush, and when Ramirez went to investigate, he found the lifeless bodies of 2 small children. The scene was gruesome, with blood splattered throughout the area where the children had been left. Ramirez immediately contacted Mexican authorities, who responded to the location and confirmed the tragic discovery. The children, later identified as Kaleo and Roxy Coleman, had suffered multiple stab wounds to their chests. According to Baja California prosecutor Hiram Sanchez Zamora, Roxy had been stabbed 12 times and Kaleo had been stabbed 17 times. A blood-stained wooden stake, believed to be connected to the spearfishing gun used in the attack, was also found at the scene. The condition of the children's bodies made it evident to investigators that this was not a random crime, but rather a deliberate and brutal attack carried out with extreme violence. The fact that such young children had been subjected to this level of cruelty sent shockwaves through both the Mexican authorities who responded to the scene and the American investigators who would soon become involved in the case. Meanwhile, back in Santa Barbara, Abby Coleman was becoming increasingly worried about her husband and children. When Matthew failed to respond to her calls and text messages throughout Sunday, August 8th, she contacted the Santa Barbara Police Department again and filed an official missing persons report. This time, her concern was more urgent as she realized that something was seriously wrong. Working with a police officer, Abby used the Find My iPhone application on her laptop to track Matthew's phone. The application showed that his phone had last been detected at a shopping mall in Rosarito, Mexico, confirming that he had indeed crossed the border with the children. This discovery alarmed both Abby and the police, as it indicated that Matthew had taken the children to a foreign country without any prior indication of his intentions. As the hours passed without any word from Matthew, Abby's anxiety grew exponentially. She couldn't help but wonder what could have driven her husband to take their children and disappear without explanation. While she still didn't believe Matthew would harm Kaleo and Roxy, she was deeply troubled by his behavior and the fact that he had deliberately avoided all contact with her. The Santa Barbara Police Department quickly realized that this case had moved beyond their jurisdiction and contacted federal authorities. The FBI became involved and began coordinating with both U.S. Customs and Border Protection and Mexican law enforcement agencies to locate Matthew and the children. The urgency of the situation was clear to everyone involved, as 2 American children were now missing in a foreign country with a father who was behaving erratically. On the afternoon of August 9, 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents at the San Isidro port of entry were on high alert for Matthew Coleman and his children. When Matthew attempted to cross back into the United States in his Mercedes Sprinter van, agents immediately noticed that he was alone. The children who had been with him when he left the country were nowhere to be found. Matthew was detained for questioning, and FBI agents were immediately called to conduct an interview. What happened next would shock even experienced law enforcement officers who had dealt with numerous violent crimes throughout their careers. Rather than maintaining his innocence or refusing to speak, Matthew quickly confessed to killing his children in what can only be described as a matter-of-fact manner. During his interview with FBI agents, Matthew explained his actions in terms of the conspiracy theories that had consumed his thinking. He told investigators that he had been enlightened by QAnon and Illuminati conspiracy theories, and that he had been receiving visions and signs that revealed crucial information about his family. In his distorted worldview, he believed that his wife Abby possessed serpent DNA and had passed this corrupted genetic material on to their children. Matthew stated that he believed his children were going to grow into monsters if he didn't take action to stop them. He told FBI agents that killing Kaleo and Roxy was the only way to save the world from the evil he believed they would spread if they were allowed to live and grow up. When agents asked him if he knew what he had done was wrong, Matthew acknowledged that he understood his actions were wrong, but insisted that they were the only course of action that would save the world. The details that Matthew provided during his confession painted a horrifying picture of the final moments of his children's lives. He admitted to using a spearfishing gun to shoot both children in their chests, explaining that he had driven them to a remote location near Rancho del Cielo before carrying out the attacks. Matthew described how 2-year-old Kaleo had not died immediately from the first wound, forcing him to move the spear around to complete the killing, an action that had cut his own hand in the process. Matthew's clinical description of the murders demonstrated the complete disconnect from reality that had overtaken his mind. The man who had once celebrated these children as gifts from God was now describing their deaths as a necessary action to prevent global catastrophe. His confession revealed the depth of his delusions and the extent to which conspiracy theories had destroyed his ability to distinguish between reality and the paranoid fantasies that had consumed his thinking. After killing the children, Matthew told investigators that he had moved their bodies into the brush approximately 30 yards from the road where the attacks had occurred. He had then disposed of the bloody spearfishing gun and his blood-stained clothing at a nearby location before returning to the hotel alone. The methodical way in which he had attempted to cover up the crime showed that, despite his claims of acting on divine visions, he understood that his actions were criminal and needed to be concealed. As FBI agents processed Matthew's confession and began coordinating with Mexican authorities, the full scope of this tragedy became clear. The bodies found by Roberto Salinas Ramirez were indeed those of Kaleo and Roxy Coleman, confirming the worst fears of everyone involved in the search. The investigation quickly shifted from a missing persons case to a double homicide that had been committed by the children's own father. Crime scene investigators on both sides of the border worked meticulously to document the evidence from this horrific crime. The location where the children's bodies were found was processed thoroughly, with investigators collecting physical evidence, taking photographs, and gathering any materials that could provide additional insight into the events that had occurred. The spearfishing gun and blood-stained clothing that Matthew had discarded were also located and collected as evidence. The international nature of the crime required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies across 2 countries. Mexican authorities had jurisdiction over the location where the murders occurred, while U.S. federal authorities had jurisdiction over Matthew as an American citizen who had committed crimes against other American citizens on foreign soil. This coordination was handled smoothly, with all agencies working together to ensure that justice would be served for Kaleo and Roxy. As investigators delved deeper into Matthew's background and mental state leading up to the murders, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of escalating paranoia and conspiracy-driven thinking. Search warrants for Matthew's electronic devices and social media accounts revealed the extent to which he had immersed himself in QAnon and other conspiracy theories in the months and weeks leading up to the crime. The news of the murders sent shockwaves throughout the Santa Barbara community, where Matthew had been known and trusted as a surf instructor and Christian mentor. Parents who had entrusted their children to Matthew's care at Lovewater Surf School struggled to comprehend how someone they had viewed as a caring teacher could be capable of such unthinkable violence against his own children. Matthew Taylor Coleman was formally charged with 2 counts of foreign first-degree murder of United States nationals, charges that carried the possibility of the death penalty under federal law. However, in 2023, after extensive psychiatric evaluation, U.S. District Judge Kathy Ann Bensavengo ruled that Matthew Coleman was not competent to stand trial. The judge found that Matthew was suffering from mental illness that prevented him from understanding the nature of the legal proceedings. He was ordered to be committed to a secure federal medical facility for treatment. In February 2023, federal prosecutors made the decision not to seek the death penalty against Matthew Coleman. This decision likely took into account his mental illness and the complex circumstances surrounding his crimes. While Matthew faced legal consequences for his actions, his wife Abby was left to cope with the unimaginable tragedy of losing both her children to violence committed by her husband. Abby's brother organized a GoFundMe campaign to help her with funeral expenses, which raised over $115,000 from donors. Friends insisted that Abby had no knowledge of Matthew's intentions when he left Santa Barbara with the children. The Santa Barbara community continued to struggle with questions about how someone they had known and trusted could commit such horrific acts. The Christian churches, where Matthew had been active, faced difficult questions about whether they had failed to recognize warning signs. Local surf instructors described feeling betrayed, with one saying he would have trusted Matthew with his own children without hesitation. Today, Matthew Taylor Coleman remains in federal custody, receiving psychiatric treatment. Whether he will ever be able to face full legal accountability for his actions remains an open question. But the legal system continues to work towards some form of justice for Kaleo and Roxy Coleman. With a heavy heart, we remember Kaleo Sky Coleman and Roxy Rain Coleman, 2 innocent children whose lives were cut short by the very person who should have protected them above all others.